Okay, let's go ahead and continue. So we went over Active Directory already, the basics of how it works. So again, a super common component of today's network architectures, and like I mentioned in answer to the question you asked, that even Active Directory incorporates the cryptographic authentication that Kerberos has, even though it's only symmetric key authentication rather than public key. But Active Directory is effectively operating at a higher level, higher network stack level than these VLANs and layer 2 and 3 switching and routing. But a lot of things can and have gone wrong with Kerberos and Active Directory as well. And so let's dive into that a little bit more. First of all, to understand this, we need to dig a little bit deeper into how Kerberos and Active Directory work. So you saw a version of this diagram before last time, where Alice needs to be able to log into various network services, network drives, and databases and stuff like that. So she first goes to the authentication server, types her password, proves to the authentication server that she's Alice. The authentication server gives her a ticket, a ticket granting ticket, and this time we're actually showing a little bit of kind of schematically what this ticket granting ticket actually looks like. So basically, it has a number of fields, such as the client information, who Alice is. So say metadata saying this is Alice, and I've checked that. User restrictions, like information what types of roles or access Alice is supposed to have and not have. The ticket lifetime, how long, when this ticket is supposed to expire by wall clock time, and flags and other stuff. That should include the HMAC as well, the cryptographic, basically cryptographic proof of correctness, but it's not explicitly shown there. But TGTs, today's ticket granting tickets often have a little addendums as kind of a flexible extension field called a privilege attribute certificate, or PAC. Now, I'm not sure the exact history of how this particular extension field arose, and it's probably one of those legacy things. They didn't, the original Kerberos design supported these particular fields. Later, they wanted more stuff, more different kinds of information, so they added this new thing called a PAC, the optional thing. And that has more information, user information, group membership, and stuff like that. So typically what's supposed to happen, the authentication server creates this ticket granting ticket saying, here's all the information about this user, what that user is supposed to be able to do and not do and stuff like that. Sends that back to Alice protected with this HMAC checksum. Alice sends the ticket granting ticket to the ticket granting server, who can check the integrity of that using the shared secret that the authentication server shares with the ticket granting server, right? And then the ticket granting, so Alice will say, okay, ticket granting server, I need a specific ticket to access server 2. So the ticket granting server will check the ticket granting ticket to make sure that Alice indeed is supposed to have access to server 2. And then if so, creates a new ticket, a service ticket to send to Alice. And that is going to be protected with an HMAC using a secret shared between the ticket granting server and server 2, right? And then Alice can take that service ticket to server 2 and says, hey, here's the evidence that you should let me talk to you and use your service, right? So again, that's how it's supposed to work, and that's the way it usually works, except when it doesn't, because of fun bugs in Active Directory, for example. So when this particular bug was first revealed, some smart aleck Twitter user created a really nice analogy to how this bug works. Basically, you carry out this attack. If you could carry out this attack checking into an airline, what you would do is basically get your normal, check in normally, get your boarding pass, and then write pilot on it in big letters, and go to the airplane and present it to the flight crew, and then the flight crew says, "Welcome, Captain. Would you like a coffee before you take off?" So that's the equivalent of what this attack is doing that was actually effective against some years ago, a version of Active Directory some years ago. So what would happen basically is the attacker would be able to request a ticket granting ticket without this extension field, this pack that was presumably added later. So it was originally optional. They had to make it backward compatible. So again, legacy compatibility is often a critical source of severe security bugs, and this is one of these examples. So these systems had to be backward compatible with systems that didn't know about this new pack thing. So the attacker now exploits this to say, okay, here's an authentication ticket without a pack as a standard user who the attacker has compromised, and so the attacker can sign in as Alice, and then the Active Directory domain controller replies with a ticket granting ticket, again with no pack, just like the without adding a pack, which is unusual on today's networks, but apparently not disallowed. There might have been a legitimate backward compatibility reason that it needed to support granting tickets with no pack and stuff like that. So, but then what the attacker does is it generates a forged pack with some other user information. So Alice's machine is compromised, but the attacker representing Alice says, okay, here's a ticket, here's a new pack for Bob. And oh, by the way, Bob is an administrator and has all these other privileges because I'm just writing pilot on the on the ticket. Basically, this is that. So the attacker just forges a pack, sends and then sends the ticket granting ticket that the otherwise legitimately signed ticket granting ticket without the pack to the domain controller, along with the forged pack as a separate field, as kind of a sideband field. And apparently the protocol supported this, right? So, and again, maybe this was because of backward compatibility considerations, or I don't know, bad protocol design. I'm sure somebody knows that. The sorted details much better than I do. But anyway, there was a way, the attacker could just send the otherwise legitimate packless ticket granting ticket and separately send, the forged pack. And then the domain controller would go, ticket granting ticket without a pack. Pack here, they must go together, right? Let's put them together and turn it into a good, I see a problem. Let me be helpful and fix it for you. And so basically the domain controller helpfully creates a new ticket granting ticket with this, pack inside, and signs it properly and sends it back to the user. And now the attacker basically has a properly HMAC signed ticket granting ticket with Bob's administrative privileges and network access, right? And so basically this allowed the attacker to become pretty much anyone he liked with any privilege he liked and kind of gain complete mastery of the network. So a nice little power play there, right? So again, just a bug, but a good example of many of those kinds of things that go wrong. And again, also a good example of the kind of things that often go wrong when protocols evolve over time with kind of flexibility, with the need to support this optional field that sometimes comes but sometimes doesn't because of backward compatibility reasons. And then, is the logic of dealing with things with and without that optional thing, is that logic secure? Well, here obviously the logic was not secure, where you take this properly authenticated thing, but combine it with this thing that was not authenticated, and so that's the kind of thing that causes these systems to really go wrong. So that's just one of a huge number of historical examples of different attacks against Active Directories that have exploited different bugs, protocol weaknesses, and so on. I'm not the biggest expert on that. You could read tons of literature, and in fact, there's even these known attacks against different versions of Active Directory are so well known and systematically exploited in the hacker black hat type community that they've even developed tools like Mimikatz that has a huge array of tools for trying to attack Active Directory, for monitoring, trying to dump, trying to analyze Active Directory tickets, trying to do things like reuse them to create credentials, to try to password crack credentials and generate so-called silver or golden tickets. And these are basically tickets that have ultimate godlike administrative privilege. That if you're a hacker and you can get a silver or golden ticket in an Active Directory domain, that basically means you have complete access to become anyone on in any of the domains in the system. That's basically God privilege, and so that's the that's kind of the crown, the equivalent of hitting the home run for the attacker. You basically have complete control over the network. Here's an example. So I mentioned passwords. So you notice that, like I said, all of these authentications are done just with normal symmetric cryptography using HMACs, keyed on these shared secrets. Now, where do those shared secrets come from? Well, you might hope that they're derived from some great big random number or some nice cryptographically secure thing. Do you think that's actually the case in practice? Apparently not. In fact, so the actual practice has traditionally been that these shared secrets that are entered into these services and the ticket granting servers are just derived from passwords, right? These are just more password derived things. Maybe they hash the password or something like that, but they're just configured passwords in these servers. And passwords being passwords, they can be cracked. Right? They can be guessed if they don't have enough entropy. And this has led to an interesting class of attacks and even a dedicated tool to carry this out called Kerberoast, which tries to roast your Kerberoast passwords, basically. So this kind of attack has been done in various ways, but here's an example of one of the kinds of attacks that Kerberoast-based password cracking can be used to carry out. So if a user already has a legitimate ticket granting ticket, the attacker has compromised Alice's machines and therefore has a valid TGT for Alice. Then she can request a she can request an actual service ticket for some Kerberos service. But then the domain controller isn't typically going to bother checking if the server, if Alice actually uses that for anything, right? So, you know, and that's kind of part of the design of Kerberos. You know, it's not, it's just the job of those servers are just to, you know, provide the right kind of tickets, the right kind of evidence to Alice as she needs to operate, you know, to prove that she has access to these services. But their job is not to babysit Alice, you know, on every time she actually uses one of those tickets to communicate with the service. That's supposed to be Alice's job to actually do that communication, right? So this was a very explicit intentional design choice for Kerberos, that, you know, kind of once the services produce once these ticket granting servers produce the ticket they're supposed to be able to forget that user and move on to other things and not, you know, have to remember or babysit everything the user is doing, right? So important design decision. So you know, ultimately, you know, this domain controller is producing the you know, the TGTs and the service tickets. Now, the thing is, furthermore, the domain controller isn't necessarily responsible for checking whether Alice actually has access to this particular server, this particular application server. Maybe she doesn't, but the application server is going to check the field in the ticket that says whether Alice has access. That's, you know, the ticket itself, the content of the ticket is what defines to the application server whether Alice has access, right? So if Alice doesn't actually have access to that server, she can still request a service ticket. The service ticket will say that she doesn't have access. If she goes to the application server and saying, here's a ticket, can I have access? The application server will say no, right? You know, you don't have access. And Alice can't forge that because she doesn't have access to the private key, right? So that's supposed to work fine. But what if the application server's shared secret with the domain controller is based on a weak password, right? So the domain controller has provided the attacker controlling Alice's workstation with a TGS based on an HMAC based on this weak password, right? So now, and these passwords are often just like short 10 to 12 character passwords. Now, you know, a decade or two ago, when Kerberos was created, this probably wasn't seen as an issue. But these days, with modern GPUs that can plow through, you know, gazillions of password attempts per second, you know, if this is based on a weak password, now the attacker, just by having that service ticket for, you know, for the application server that Alice doesn't even have access to, but he has the cryptographic, you know, the HMAC that's keyed on that weak password, and then the attacker can then go offline, you know, go back home, start up the big array of GPUs that he has in his basement, or launch the big operation on Amazon EC2 or whatever to try to try gazillions of potential passwords and see which password produces a match that can reproduce that HMAT in the ticket granting in the service ticket. And then, kind of with enough tries, if the password is weak, he's going to find it, right? Just by brute force again. And he's going to be able to verify that offline without doing any further network activity. All he needed was that one exchange with the domain controller, and and he can get basically roast the password. And then when he has that password, then he has he has the application server's shared password with the domain controller. Now he can pretend to be any other user. He can forge a ticket to that application server to say, hey, I'm not Alice anymore. Now I'm Bob, and trust me because here's my the HMAC of the domain controller. He can basically impersonate the domain controller to the application server to create any ticket he wants to the application server. Yeah, you had a question? Yeah.
Why would they actually derive password? Derive the key from a password? Like, it doesn't make any sense to derive the key from a password in those two parts, right? So there is no user. That's on the server side.
So these are passwords that the users never see, or should never see, right? So these are passwords that only the sysadmins see. So the sysadmins, when the sysadmin sets up the domain controller and the application server, they have root level access. They're writing the config files for the domain controller and the application server. They enter this password manually. That's it's basically like a root password, but it's a root password for the relationship between the domain controller and the application server, right?
Exactly, but they can actually just put like a super random stuff, and yeah, that's secure, right?
Yeah. So if the administrator was generating a long, high entropy, 20-character password, then Kerberos would not work. And in fact, kind of now it's of course standard practice to use a long, ideally, strongly randomly generated password for these kinds of things. But that's a little less convenient administratively because the administrator has to either generate a long random password on one and copy it to the other manually, or write down and type in a much longer thing. It's what we should have been doing all along. But back in the day, it was thought that 10 to 12 character passwords were totally good enough. And I mean, Kerberos was a well-designed protocol. Kerberos was well aware that you should never send a clear text password on the network, and it did. It got that right. Kerberos never sends a clear text password on the network, and it's never even sending a direct password hash on the network. At least current versions, it's sending an HMAC, which is it still has this limitation, of course, but it's not even, ever, as far as I know, sending just plain hashes of passwords. And so, these things have to be, it still takes a lot of brute force to crack these things. But, back when Kerberos was designed, it wasn't thought that 10 to 12 character, that was a pretty big search space back then, but that was before these giant GPU farms and Amazon EC2 and stuff like that, right? And so again, so this is in a way just another instance of another illustration of the danger of an attacker getting something cryptographically derived from a password, a potentially low entropy password, and getting that offline. So we a few lectures ago we looked into the password cracking for password databases. This is exactly the equivalent, but for passwords just used in a different way. Again, not too unintelligently, but in a way that was designed for 10 or 20 years ago and not for today's hardware. Yeah. Okay. So another nice little way to that things like Active Directory sometimes goes wrong. And again, these are just a couple point examples. There have been a gazillion other security issues with Active Directory and Kerberos. So other things just based on bugs and stuff like that. But that's hopefully gives you a window onto some of the way networks work and the way they often go wrong. Let's now look at VPNs a little bit. So VPNs, the need for VPNs have been driven by the demand, universal demand for companies to be able to access the corporate network, kind of get past the corporate firewall when they're necessarily traveling remotely. Businessmen and stuff, business people would never accept a corporate network that didn't give them some way to, access critical services from, when they're traveling. Business just wouldn't get done, even if that's what would, in principle, be best for security. When you're off premises, you just don't get access. That's just not feasible, and that's what VPNs are designed to support. So they're kind of an uncomfortable compromise. Between for accessibility and convenience, we would prefer the corporate network, prefer the remote employees to be able to contact corporate network services from anywhere, anytime, but that would be insanely terrible for security. We've got to have the we can't let the firewalls permit that. But for authorized remote access, regional and remote regional offices, remote users, and stuff like that, we got to give them access somehow, and that is usually provided through VPNs. And basically, the operation VPNs operate in different ways, but ultimately they just create an encrypted tunnel between the remote location and the VPN server at the head office, and then they make the local, regional or remote user's device think it's on the corporate network, so it can actually talk to the server, the different database and the network services at the corporate network that are behind the firewall, even though the user is remote. Right? So there's various ways to do these. One type. The first type is very common for just stitching together multiple offices. When a company has fixed headquarters, fixed offices at multiple locations that all need to talk to headquarters or to each other. You typically create basically a firewall VPN at each side, and then that encrypts all the traffic between the different networks, physically separate networks, and stitches them together. Right. So that's for handling multiple fixed offices typically. The others are more for remote users or mobile or remote who need to be able to get onto the corporate network from wherever they are. Right? And there's multiple network layers at which these can be implemented, and sometimes are. IPsec or IP security is an extension to the Internet Protocol. So this is a layer 3 form of VPN that's basically I won't get into the details, but when you're using an IPsec based or layer 3 VPN, basically your device is taking packets going to corporate network services, and they're propagating down the network stack down through TCP and then down to layer 3, and then getting redirected, encrypted and inserted into a tunnel, and then redirected at internet routing level to the remote server, which then decapsulates that at layer 3 at the IPsec level and sends it back up the stack. So MPLS, multi-level protocol layer switching, is a different is a protocol that operates at layer 2. It's at the equivalent of Ethernet layer, but it's a feature that's in many high-end switches that basically allows allows administrators to define the exact paths that particular packets flow through a corporate network. You could see it as kind of a super, even more controllable version of VLANs, or something that can be implemented, that can be used to implement VLAN type functionality in an even more precisely controllable way, where you get to define which exact paths packets take through a network infrastructure. We won't get into the details now, but then there are also link layer VPN technologies, which are very common, especially in mobile users. Which basically what these do is take, say, Ethernet packets. If you're using one of these, then when you're connecting to a service on the corporate network, your packets are all going all the way down through TCP and IP, and then down to a fake Ethernet device. You'll typically see a fictitious Ethernet device. If you look at the internal details, which then which doesn't really exist, but then it just takes the Ethernet packet, encrypts it, sends it back up the stack, and through a tunnel, through an encrypted tunnel across the internet to the remote VPN server, that then decapsulates that Ethernet packet and sends it on a particular VLAN that you're associated with your role, or as if you were on that specific Ethernet VLAN at your home network. And so that's kind of convenient because it's lower level. It's kind of convenient because it doesn't get in the way of. So Ethernet broadcast works. Like if you use neighbor discovery, service discovery protocols in the corporate network to discover network drives, the things that normally rely on Ethernet broadcast and multicast, those will keep working while you're remote and using a link layer 2 VLAN, because Ethernet broadcast packets that your device sends out are going to be tunneled, encrypted and tunneled over to the network and get broadcast out on the appropriate VLAN, and so you'll be able to discover services. So that's nice in terms of convenience, but it also has some different complexity and implications. So those are just, I don't have time to get deep into the details of either of those, and I won't get into specific attacks. But in general, in general, the most important point is that these kind of services are very pervasive. And again, kind of represent a compromise between the need for remote access, with all of the potential security issues that might create, versus the need to implement this network compartmentalization. Okay, so now let's look at the perimeter security. Kind of how to protect the firewall, protect the whole perimeter with the firewall. So this is again a standard practice that goes that's basically seen as kind of the starting point. Typically, these firewalls primarily protect against incoming traffic coming from the public internet, but sometimes they are designed to prevent traffic going out as well, depending on the firewall policy. And this is another kind of determining these types of firewall policies is another constant network challenge between that tends to explore these tensions between usability and security. So, you know, how restrictive to set these firewalls. Typically, they have a huge range of potential policies that can be set. For home networks, usually the home network routers that you install typically by default come with policies that restrict traffic coming in but allow anything going out. Many corporate networks are much more restrictive, say only allowing certain types of traffic, certain applications, and according to a security policy. Now, just to give you, again, to dive a little bit into the details of how these work, there are basically three general types of firewalls, or levels of granularity at which these firewalls often work. Packet filters are the simplest, two stateful packet filters, and then application gateways. So a simple packet filter, so this is a simple packet filter is pretty much considered obsolete these days, but that's where kind of firewalls kind of started. Basically, a simple packet filter just looks at packets coming into or trying to cross the firewall, and looks at the information in the IP header, typically the IP address, and also typically the transport protocol. What is this, an HTTP packet or is it something else? TCP flags, the IP addresses, and these kinds of things can do coarse-grained filtering just based on transport and port number, typically, and this is enough to implement certain policies, like say forbid people from browsing the web by dropping all outgoing packets for port 80. Some companies do this. They say, hey, you're supposed to be doing that, not browsing the web. So so this is a simple, if not very sophisticated way of implementing those kinds of policies. Now, the nice thing of these packet filters is they can be pretty much stateless. They don't have to. They're cheap and fast, and because they don't have to remember anything. They just look at each packet, check its header against a policy, and decide yes or no. Is it allowed? Yes. If transmit. If no, drop. Right. But they have, a lot of limitations, both in the types of policies they can enforce and also potential vulnerabilities. For example, IP, the Internet Protocol, has a very basic feature called fragmentation. So you send a big packet across the Internet. Somebody in the middle of the network can and might well break it into several smaller IP packets. It's a standard IP protocol feature. And in that case, what happens if, for example, if you have a big TCP or UDP packet and that gets fragmented, then only the first fragment at IP level will actually contain a copy of the TCP or UDP header. The other fragments will have other parts of the TCP or the original TCP or UDP segment, but not a copy of the header, because at the IP level at the receiver is supposedly going to put them back together and reconstruct the whole TCP, UDP header and segment and stuff like that, right? But a stateless packet and these fragments might get misordered. If a packet filter is truly stateless and is trying to make decisions only on the basis of this one packet without any memory, then what does it do with a packet that contains an IP packet that contains that doesn't contain the transport level header? Well, it doesn't know the transport level port numbers that packet is associated with. And so often what a stateless packet filter would just do is just saying, okay, I can't make a decision on the transport, the port number, so I'll just have to let the packet go. Otherwise, if I dropped it, then I would be killing all fragmented traffic, and users would scream because it will break everything, right? So because they can't make the decision, they kind of have to let the packet go. But attackers have shown that that can be exploited. You can create an attacker can create a packet that deliberately exploits that by, say, fragmenting this TCP packet into a 1 byte segment followed by the rest, a separate segment containing the rest of the packet. And so the first byte will have an incomplete transport header, which can't be checked, and then the other segment will contain the rest of the transport layer header, which the packet filter won't bother trying to check because it's not the first packet in the fragmentation sequence, right? So these kinds of statelessness is both an advantage and a disadvantage. So in contrast, a stateful packet filter keeps track of connection state. It keeps track of whether a TCP connection is when a TCP SYN packet, which creates a connection, goes across the packet filter, it'll say, aha, I see a new connection being created. I'm going to record information that this is a TCP connection, that it's live, and I'm going to check things about that. And it can do a lot more checking. And by holding state, it can deal with things like the fragmentation-related attack. It can reassemble packets potentially before checking whether they're allowed or not, and thereby always be able to to make a correct decision based on the transport protocol number and other information, right? But this requires the packet filter to maintain more state. It becomes a bigger, more costly, and also more vulnerable potentially to other kinds of attacks. So how might you attack a stateful packet filter if you wanted to do something bad? Yeah? SYN flooding, exactly, or any kind of state overload attack. Create a lot of connections to max out the state size, and then you'll start cause the thing to start dropping the connections of the legitimate users, or forgetting other state that it should be remembering, and this can be a very effective denial of service attack, right? So the more stateful one of these firewall, the more state that these firewalls try to maintain, often that makes them more vulnerable to the smarter they try to be, the more vulnerable to DOS attacks they often are. So yeah. So this is a relatively inexpensive improvement that offers better deep packet inspection, but still very limited. Then you go up the stack, and kind of the more state of the art. The fanciest type of firewall tries to kind of really get in the middle, maybe not even just at the transport level, but even sometime at the application level, like at the HTTP level. And what these do, they're often like proxy servers of various kinds. The client is trying to connect to this web server, but the proxy server in the middle is going to, run by this firewall, is going to actually intercept and be the TCP endpoint to accept the client's request and open a new TCP endpoint over to the web server. and forward everything both ways while checking everything that goes on, and in this case, this proxy server can check, can see everything that goes across the TCP connection in order. It's more powerful. It's not vulnerable to these fragmentation attacks because everything gets reassembled and resequenced at the proxy before going on, right? So it's much more powerful in what it can do. It can check for viruses, stuff like that. But again, it requires even more work, a lot more work, more state, more potential DOS attack vulnerability in various ways. And it tends to be very specific to particular applications. If it supports this application and not that other application, well, then you have to do a much more coarse-grained decision. Right? So that's basically how firewalls typically work. There's a lot, of course, a lot more we could say in general, but in general, firewalls, nobody in their right mind would run a corporate network without a firewall these days. On the other hand, we've come to the firm realization that firewalls are a very, very, very far thing from a kind of complete protection from the network. Partly because they're never complete in their protection. They don't prevent insider attacks, and insider attacks where any one machine in the corporate network is compromised in some way are completely common, so common that you just have to assume that there's always going to be some successful attack of some machine in the network. And then they also have weaknesses and costs, such as creating vulnerability to DOS attacks. Going to even more sophisticated categories, a lot of companies have started building bigger intrusion detection systems that try to monitor packets, do deep packet inspection across many applications, and try to make kind of machine learning type inferences. Try to learn what the normal traffic patterns look like, and then detect if something different from that appears. Like, do I detect some new flow of packets that looks a lot different from anything that I've seen before? Create an alert, tell the administrator, there's something new going on. It might or might not be anything to worry about, but then maybe the administrators go and explore. Let's see, which machine is sending that traffic? Is it because the user is running something new that's perfectly legit, but just they hadn't run before, or is it perhaps a sign of compromise? And so there's various ways to do that. Signature-based, where they look for particular patterns that look for particular viruses, known issues, known signs. There are examples of that, like Snort. And then there's anomaly-based systems that take more of a approach of trying to profile normal traffic and then see if they see something different going on. Right. And those each have a signature-based system is always going to kind of maybe reliably detect yesterday's threats, but never detect the new and latest threat. Whereas an anomaly-based system might have a better chance of detecting new, unknown, previously unknown threats, but they have significant false positives and false negatives. They can send administrators on wild goose chases on non-problems all the time, and you get tired of it and you turn down the sensitivity, and then you miss the actual threat. So. And I guess I'm out of time, so I'll probably basically skip the logging and backup. So I already talked about it a little bit, but again, deciding what to log and for what reasons is also an important technical challenge in administering networks. So, and the slides for that are online. So, okay, so thanks, and see you next week.